Welcome to the Gentleman Gunner. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Sig P320 SXG, with that S standing for steel frame. But before we get into the nitty gritty, let's set the stage with some context. When I first got into action pistol, the P320 was a fairly common sight on the competition scene. However, this was also the period when negative discussions about the platform began to gain traction. Because of that, I never really considered the P320 until they released the SXG. Now you might be wondering why I'm reviewing this gun today, especially after SIG's recent press release. The reason? Well, most of the common concerns I read about seem to revolve around earlier variants of the P320. Now for transparency, I actually purchased this firearm before the press release using my NRA discount. If you are here for the dramatic malfunction, you might be disappointed because this one didn't explode on me. Instead, I'll just share my honest findings, and to add to that, I've carried a P365 as my primary everyday carry for years without any issues. Now before we dive into this, I have a message for my YouTube manual reviewer. This firearm is in its factory configuration. No modifications have been made. The optic that you see on here is not an internal modification and complies with all of the YouTube firearms policy. At first sight, the P320 has always had a larger than life look to it, and that continues with the SXG. Now, Sig claims that the frame and slide is a stainless steel finish with a bead blast to it. The interesting thing I found was that for whatever reason, there is a little surface rust developing on the bottom side of my frame. I think that's a result of the finish they actually have as a protective coat on here. And this thing is a tank at a dry weight of 48 ounces. The balance is centered, I'd say, right around here in the trigger area. So when I release here, it does tend to dip. And that's going to play into the manipulation and the performance when we start to talk about transitions and reloads, so I'll save that for a little bit later. With a price tag of just shy under $1,800, you're typically buying something tailored for a specific purpose, and in this case, I'd argue that it's competition. However, despite the price tag, this is still a high volume production gun, meaning it is going to have some wiggles and shimmies as you go through the top of this. The upside, it's forgiving with ammo choices and even the environmental conditions. In fact, I had zero reliability issues during my testing. Now, from a perceived value standpoint, it would have been nice to see a tighter fit. I've always appreciated how P320s feel natural and just solid in the hands. I mean, this undercut underneath will really help you get your hand underneath the beaver tail here. And there's plenty of real estate on the sides here to really lay in your support hand, so it is ideal. Now the serrations here, they're perfectly contoured on the top side of this, and you start to have these indentations here to really ensure that you get a grip. Now surprisingly, I will say the thing I noticed is how light of a spring they come from the factory, being at 12.5 pounds, and what that means to you is a very light rack. Now the front sights are going to be a fiber optic green, and because I have an optic on it, you do lose the rear sight when you decide to put one on here. But I have a Romeo 1 Pro, and the cool thing about using a native optic is that you do have a slight beveling in the rear to see the front sight should you want to co-witness with that. Now this grip texture is very aggressive, and that's great because it's made by Locke, who's become a household name in the competition scene. And what I like about this over the TXG module is that you have these swappable panels and back straps, so you can tailor that to more your fit and like. For my first shots, I compared the SXG to my Shadow Tube and my Walther PDP steel frame. But getting into the recoil impulse, I will say that this gun was actually softer than the other two, especially the Shadow 2 being a gun that's already tuned for competition. I would say what I attribute to that was number one being the overall spring setup, but also the weight of the gun really does help this gun settle. And you would think for this gun being on the higher bore axis side that it would maybe flip a little bit more, but I actually found this gun to track quite flat. So when I would do follow-up shots or anything like that, it would have a consistent return to zero. Now the one thing I do want to talk about is the reset. I like that it does have quite a bit of tension to push your finger right back up, but the thing is, if you're used to a shorter reset like I have on my Shadow 2 and the Walther, you would have to get used to this. In fact, I actually had a couple of stages where I had a little trigger freeze.
The reset sucks, David!
Now, something what I've learned with a lot of SIGs is that they just don't have the best trigger out of the box. And for me, that showed up in the accuracy and precision drill. Now, the bench rest was great. This gun did what I expected, which is about a 3 to 4 inch group. But when I went to the practical component, which is where I do this freehand, it was a challenge for me to roll through that whole trigger cycle in the beginning. And it being fairly gritty and having quite a bit of weight, because essentially it has a 2-stage trigger, it was a challenge for me to nail this at 25 yards. Now, these guns do have a break-in period and they start to smooth out. And I would say that's about around the 300 to 500 round range. And just briefly going over that trigger characteristics, initially you have a little bit of light pre-travel and you get to what is essentially a first wall. Now, how these safeties work on the 320, you are going to be having to barrel through quite a bit of weight. So what it feels like as you're pushing that, you're starting to roll through the safeties and you get to a second wall. And if you're familiar with some of my talk on double action, I do talk about stacking. That's how this feels. Essentially, your first stage is probably a good 5 pounds, and then it maybe drops to a pound on your final break, such as you see here. Now, that is about a 90-degree break, so I do appreciate it breaking there. And that reset will just force your finger right back out. Now, I will point out though that most guns, especially like Glock is what comes to mind, when you have that reset, it does put you right back on its wall and you can do a break. This starts you through that whole first cycle, essentially staging you at the first wall. So you will have to roll through that cycle again. Going with the ever popular 25-yard build drill, I did expect this gun to do reasonably well on this particular test. Now, in comparison to my Shadow 2, it was actually just a touch faster. However, I wasn't able to squeeze the accuracy out of this gun like I did with my Shadow 2. So if we're looking at raw time, you're going to give it to the SXG, but the hit factor, which is king in this sport, which balances time and accuracy, it will go to my Shadow 2. But again, I share those guys just to give you a thought on how and why I feel the way I do about these guns. Oddly enough, in the match I shot with this gun, I also brought along the Grey Guns 320 Lockwood, which I will do a review on it separately. The cool thing about having both guns at the same match is I really get a comparison of what different weights can do. And in this case, we had 2 targets on one stage that were noticeably farther away than the rest. The handling characteristics of where this gun started to stick out to me is when I would take on any type of far target, especially because you got to remember we're trying to get about a 4-inch wide and 8-inch tall A-zone. And when I lined up for these 2 particular longer targets, which I would say they were around the 17 to 20 yard range, I felt that I could drive this gun a lot quicker and faster, and it showed up in the times, as you can see when I compare the 2. And that became the theme for this gun versus my Grey Guns 320, which I felt I had to take a touch more time on far targets. And switching to transitions, and particularly the transition drill, I found anytime I had to engage a target aggressively, this gun was forgiving. There were times where I pulled off targets thinking, oh no, that's a Delta or a Mike, only to find out I just landed a perfect Alpha. Now that's worth highlighting because the weight of it does make it slower to swing. When I compare that to my PX4, which we had similar hits with the gun, the time was about 3/10 slower, which makes up in the hit factor because we had identical hits. So that is something worth highlighting when you do pick up a heavier gun. Now, I will say this, the biggest positive, because this was my first experience with the 320, were the reloads of this gun. The reloads for this I found effortless. That is one advantage of having a little bit more weight on the top end here, is that the gun rotates a little easier for that. Now, the one thing I did notice is that there is a good amount of beveling in the frame. What's interesting is these side panels do participate in the side beveling on the sides, as you'll see. And at least a positive of that is that if these sides do get chewed up and you run it without the magwell, you know that at least you have the option of replacing the sides on these. And that's about where most of the wear tends to be when you're doing these really aggressive reloads. Now, they do come with 321 round magazines, and for competition, that's going to be okay, especially if you decide you want to be in limited optics or carry optics for USPSA. But it is fairly easy to buy a spring and follower kit that will take you to 23 rounds, and that's what I would recommend. But at least from what comes with the factory, you are good to go and compete out of the box. Now, speaking of competition, well, let's see where this lands. I'm just going to say for IDPA it's a no because the gun is too heavy for anything in their classes. But for USPSA, where this gun goes, and as you see it here, it is for limited optics because of the magwell. And removing that magwell, well, puts you in carry optics, and you can use the same magazines. Now, if you want to go with the iron sight setups, you have your option between production and limited. With limited, you're going to be relegated to just minor, but if you decide to go with production, you can run it without the magwell and go for it. For holsters, if you already have something for the X5 Legion, that holster just fits in there nicely, and there's no fitting or anything you'd have to think about. So holsters aren't a challenge, and I ran one directly from Sig, who is made by Comptac. The biggest challenge I see with this particular gun is that it is late to the game. While I'd like to make a side case that the 320 has enough time in the market to have a robust aftermarket, it's really hard to say that the SXG is anything special at this point, considering even the price point it's starting to grab into. And since this gun's release, I have yet to see this gun in any competition at this point. In fact, I haven't even seen any of the main SIG shooters from the factory that are using the SXG. They seem to be sticking with the TXG grip module that has been popular over the years, and I have a theory why that I will save for the gray guns video. Now, if you run this gun in competition, please drop a comment. I'd love to hear how it's working out for you. And also, now that SIG has entered the steel frame striker fired market, would you be interested in a head-to-head shootout? Let's say between the Walther PDP match steel frame or the Canik Rival S? Let me know. And with that said, guys, remember, do not buy the gun that you love to shoot, get the gun that makes you love shooting. And until next time, we will see you all at the range.